Political tradition in Korea. Continuity, transformation, and modern democratic identity. 1. Introduction. Korea's political tradition is characterized by a dynamic interplay between inherited cultural norms and modern institutional reforms, unlike Western political development, which often emerge through revolution, and the gradual expansion of liberal democracy. Korean political tradition evolved through Confucian statecraft, colonial intervention, post-war, authoritarianism, and recent democratization. This tradition is neither monolithic nor static. Instead, it is a living structure, constantly reshaped by historical contingencies, civil society movements, and global influences. Understanding Korea's political tradition thus requires examining both deep-rooted ideological and institutional legacies and the transformations that have occurred under the pressures of modernization, division, and democratization. 2. Confucian statecraft and dynastic legacy. 2.1 Joseon dynasty and Confucian governance. The Joseon dynasty, 1392-1910, laid the ideological foundation for Korea's political tradition. Neo-Confucianism, adopted as the state philosophy, guided governance and moral conduct. The monarch, perceived as the father of the people, ruled through moral authority, deokchi jongchi, and political legitimacy, depended on virtue rather than force. Bureaucrats were selected through rigorous civil service examinations gwagyo, reflecting meritocratic principles grounded in Confucian ethics. This political culture emphasized hierarchical order. Authority flows from the monarch to local officials, and ultimately to the family unit. Moral governance. Political leadership required ethical integrity, benevolence and ritual propriety, public duty and education. Civic virtue was cultivated through Confucian texts and communal moral instruction. Even after the decline of Joseon, Confucian ideals remained embedded in Korean political consciousness, influencing later forms of authority and bureaucracy. 3. Disruption and transformation under Japanese colonialism, 1910-1945. The Japanese annexation of Korea in 1910 disrupted the indigenous political order. Korea was stripped of sovereignty, and traditional elites were marginalized or co-opted. Yet, this period also gave rise to nationalist resistance movements and political awakening. 3.1 Suppression and political socialization. Japanese colonial rule eliminated Korean political institutions and introduced a centralized bureaucratic model. While oppressive, the colonial administration also introduced modern statecraft, infrastructure, and education, ironically, laying the groundwork for Korea's future bureaucratic state. 3.2 Rise of nationalist and socialist ideologies. In response to colonial domination, Korean political activists embraced modern ideologies such as liberal nationalism emphasizing sovereignty, modernization and civil rights, e.g. March 1st Movement, 1919, socialism and communism, particularly influential in the North, advocating anti-imperialism, class struggle, and collective ownership. These ideologies would later shape the divergent political paths of North and South Korea after liberation in 1945. 4. Division and authoritarian development. 4.1 Cold War context and institutional bifurcation. Korea's liberation from Japan in 1945 led to the peninsula's division. The South, under U.S. influence, adopted a presidential system, while the North established a communist state. Each half reflected both inherited traditions and Cold War ideologies. 4.2 South Korea, authoritarianism and developmental state. From 1948 to 1987, South Korea experienced prolonged authoritarian rule. Presidents Syngman Rhee, Park Chung-hee, and Chun Doo-hwan governed with strong state control, often justifying suppression in the name of national security and economic growth. Park Chung-hee's era, 1961-1979. A turning point in modern Korean political tradition, Park institutionalized the developmental state, blending Confucian paternalism with military discipline and technocratic governance. Political participation was limited, but economic modernization was aggressively pursued. Legacy. The notion of a benevolent authoritarian leader persisted in public consciousness, reflecting Confucian notions of centralized moral leadership. 4.3 North Korea, dynastic totalitarianism. Kim Il-sung established a one-party state based on Juche ideology, self-reliance, merging Marxist-Leninist rhetoric with Confucian-style filial piety. The regime evolved into a dynastic socialist monarchy, where political legitimacy was concentrated in the leader's moral authority, amplified by propaganda and isolationism. 5. Democratic transition and civic political tradition. 5.1 Democratization and the 1987 June movement. The 1987 mass uprising marked a turning point. Public demands for political liberalization led to constitutional reform and direct presidential elections. Civil society, rooted in student movements, labor activism, and religious organizations, became a driving force behind democratization. 5.2 Emergence of participatory political culture. The post-1987 era witnessed regular democratic elections with peaceful transfers of power, vibrant civil society, demonstrated by large-scale movements like the 2002 anti-U.S. protests and the 2016-17 Candlelight Revolution. Public accountability with former presidents E.G. Roh Tae-woo, Park Geun-hye held legally responsible for corruption or abuse of power. This transformation reflects a blending of traditional moral expectations. Leaders must act virtuously with democratic norms, citizen sovereignty, and legal accountability. 6. Key themes in Korean political tradition. 6.1 Moral politics and public virtue. Despite institutional democratization, Korea's political culture remains moralistic. Citizens often judge leaders not only by policy outcomes, but by personal integrity, sincerity, and moral symbolism. Political scandals involving dishonor or corruption provoke widespread outrage as they violate Confucian-inflected moral expectations. 6.2 Family metaphor and authority. Korean politics continues to use familiar language e.g., the president as the father of the nation. This reinforces vertical relationships in politics and society, where age, seniority, and loyalty still carry significant weight. While this supports social cohesion, it may also hinder pluralism and challenge-based politics. 6.3 Nationalism and collective identity. Both the left and right in Korean politics draw on nationalist discourse. While conservatives emphasize anti-communism and military strength, progressives often invoke anti-colonial resistance and cultural pride. Political legitimacy is often tied to one's perceived contribution to national independence or unification. 7. Tensions and challenges in modern Korean politics. 7.1 Legacy of authoritarianism. South Korea's rapid democratization has not fully dismantled its authoritarian legacy. Presidential power remains strong, bureaucracy is top-down, and political parties are often personality-centered. Democratic institutions must continually evolve to ensure checks and balances. 7.2 Polarization and populism. Contemporary Korean politics is marked by deep partisan division. Populist leaders sometimes invoke traditional values or anti-elite rhetoric to mobilize support, while others appeal to modernity and reform. This polarization reflects the friction between traditional authority and democratic pluralism. 7.3 Generational shift and civic maturity. Younger generations increasingly challenge traditional hierarchies, gender roles, and nationalism. Feminist movements, environmental activism, and labor struggles reflect a more rights-based, participatory political ethos. This signals a new phase in Korea's political tradition less deferential, more egalitarian. 8. Conclusion. Korea's political tradition is a story of continuity and change. Rooted in Confucian morality, dynastic legitimacy, and collective identity, it has adapted to the demands of modern nationhood, Cold War geopolitics, and democratic mobilization. Far from being eradicated, traditional values such as moral leadership, public virtue, and national unity have been repurposed within democratic frameworks. In modern Korean society, political tradition is not a relic, but a resilient, evolving force, one that shapes how citizens view authority, power, justice, and participation. The Korean case illustrates how indigenous traditions can coexist with, challenge, and ultimately enrich liberal democratic institutions, producing a hybrid political culture, both deeply historical and vibrantly modern.